Welcome everyone. For those just joining in, if you want to go on mute, that'd be brilliant. There will be a chance to ask questions throughout the session and mute yourself. But welcome again. As you probably see from the entrance slide, my name is Irina Marenica, and I am a business psychologist with a company called Genius Within. What I do and focus mostly in my work is diagnostic assessments for neurodiversity in various employments, in various settings, work settings. I do diagnostics, I do workplace evaluations for neurodiversity and disability, and I also deliver coaching in workplaces, working with line managers, working with employees or teams, and also work systems to really make sure that we allow our clients to make the most of their potential and succeed in their employment role and be at their best. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. We have a few parts to this session. So in the first sort of 20 minutes-ish, I will be talking about neurodiversity and what it means to have a neurodiverse condition, what you may notice that to doing an assessment or seeking support. Also, we will look at the workplace impact and again what you might be noticing, and also supporting colleagues or really seeking that help and managing diversity and performance, supporting systems, tips and some coping strategies. Might be the case that you might find those coping strategies helpful for you now if you're going through studies. So keep an eye out for that. And before we dive into the session, can I ask a raise of hands? Just use the reaction button on Zoom if you have heard the term neurodiversity before this training, or is it something that is completely new? So thumbs up if you have heard the term. I see a few hands straight away. Brilliant. Fantastic. Anyone else? That's fine. It is a term that is quite new and it's had a lot of spotlight and a lot of recognition in the social media in the last few years. So it is emerging and it's becoming the employers or line managers and organizations are becoming a lot more aware of how they can support neurodiverse individuals, which is a real positive. Okay, that being said, let's start off with the session. So just a few numbers for you to consider. 90% of disabilities aren't visible, and statistically every 1 in 7 individuals in a workplace has some form of a mental health need. And the general cost to the economy is around £26 billion each year, and this is a pre-pandemic figure, so we suspect that it might be increasing given the impact that the pandemic has had, also in terms of something that is called acquired neurodiversity, which I will touch on in just a moment. So when we speak about neurodiversity, there's a few things to note here. The term neurodiversity, where does it come from? It doesn't come from clinical or medical models. It comes from social sciences, interestingly. And what it is, it reflects everyone's ability to learn or think differently. It highlights that we're all perceiving the information and learning in a different way, and we prefer to learn maybe visually or through hearing information or through recording details. So there's always room to consider when you learn at your best. What is your way of learning or working? What works for you? And neurodiversity, to that extent, is this umbrella term that really signifies that there is that variation in how we think or how we learn. In the personality sort of domain, you can think of things like introversion, extroversion, yeah, and in the sort of cognitive or thinking aspect of psychology, we talk about neurodiversity and divergence in thinking. Specifically to applied neurodiversity, you may have heard of the terms dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. You may have heard of DCD, which stands for Developmental Coordination Disorder. A name that might be more familiar is dyspraxia, but it's the same condition. It's just in the UK, we call it DCD, or Developmental Coordination Disorder. And what is of note with applied neurodiversity is that it tends to be genetic. So people are born with dyslexia, dyscalculia, or dysgraphia. Hence why in the assessments, we would sometimes ask, do you have any siblings with similar difficulties, or maybe parents or sometimes children that experience similar challenges? So these conditions are genetic. And they are also related to applied and educational skills, reading. In dyspraxia, we would look at things like fine motor control, so handwriting, how are you with taking written notes? You know, do you notice that you might be particularly slow with taking those notes? Or is the handwriting, is it legible, or is there difficulties with reading that handwriting? So that's the fine motor control and doing maybe fine skills such as using scissors or cutlery, for example. Yeah, but then with dyspraxia, we also look at gross movements or big movements, hand-eye coordination, balance, tripping over, falling over, you know, walking into things, sports, yeah, that require those kind of big movements. Again, if people are struggling with those, that might be an indicator. With dyslexia, we would always look at slower reading speed potentially, or maybe someone reads really, really fast and struggles to take in the information that they're reading and misses details or misplaces or replaces words in sentences that completely change what they have read. So those might be things of note with dyslexia. Spelling can be affected. Again, yeah, remembering how to spell specific words or put your thoughts in writing. It may be a sense that you have an idea that you want to put either in an essay or an assignment, but then when it comes to actually wording it in a written sentence, you feel like that does not come out right. That wasn't what I was hoping to say. And also structuring written assignments, for instance, or when you need to produce kind of lengthier pieces of information. Yeah, with dyslexia, that might be more of a challenge. Dyscalculia is really specific to processing numbers. So if you struggle with mental maths, or if you've struggled with maths throughout school, that might be something connected to dyscalculia. Things like telling time, using the round clock can be more challenging. So other sorts of things. And dysgraphia is, again, really, really specific to handwriting. You may want to sort of note, or you may have noticed and you want to sort of ask about that. Irina, you've mentioned handwriting in relation to at least 3 conditions: dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dysgraphia. And one thing that is really important with neurodiverse conditions is the fact that they overlap quite significantly. There is that existence for the overlap, and I will tell you later in the training how that is addressed from the perspective of an employment or legally, so you will know this. However, I really want to highlight that the notion of overlap is more of a rule than an exception. If someone comes in with a label of ADHD, for example, it doesn't mean that they only have concentration difficulties. They may struggle still with reading or processing, you know, information in revision or something similar, or sitting exams, for example. But, you know, they may have only a label of ADHD. So we would still work with them and what are the specific needs of an employee or an individual. And then moving on from applied neurodiversity, moving into the clinical neurodiversity, here we look at Tourette syndrome, autism, and ADHD. So ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You may be familiar with the term ADD, which is attention deficit disorder. In the UK, we go for either predominantly inattentive type of ADHD, predominantly hyperactive type of ADHD, or a combined type, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So as the name suggests, yeah, with the predominantly inattentive, people may have quite a lot of difficulties with distractibility, being easily distracted by sounds or noises or visual stimulation. Then, you know, it may affect their productivity. And also with the hyperactivity side, yeah, we might notice more impulsiveness or restlessness, a lot of difficulty sitting still. We work a lot with people who are in what pre-pandemic were working before, were working in an open plan setting. So if they are specifically experiencing quite a lot of difficulties with being distracted in an open plan office, is there different arrangements that can be made for their seating to support their focus? That is something that we would take into account and look out for. I've had a chat comment. Let me just have a quick look at that. Thank you, Sarah. It's important if someone has all of these conditions but has not been addressed ever. I suppose it is the question of what they would like to have happen and if they want to be seeking support, but also in part, and this I will cover later in a session, is what kind of support is available and what might they be looking out for, what specific support is right for them. So that is something to consider as well. So jumping back into the acquired neurodiversity, there can be an aspect of neurodiversity which we call transient or temporal. So if someone's never reported difficulties in school, maybe, or in any kind of previous education, yeah, with reading, writing, or concentration, but they've gone through potentially a really difficult time in their lives, and they maybe report things like PTSD or burnout or depression, anxiety, sort of the increased mental health needs or concerns, they might sort of have that notion that they're not at their best. Their memory can go, their ability to remember and recall information can be affected, but also, yeah, things like their concentration or their performance, their productivity can be really not at their best. And this is what happens with sort of transient neurodiversity. Chances is, if they have if they've had sought support either through counselling or really medical treatments that are appropriate for them, chances is their performance will be back to the kind of levels that it has been before, but also they will have support systems in place if at all they feel like there is a relapse, or they're feeling more anxious, or they've gone into maybe a new environment, new employer, new job setting, even a new team in work. Yes, so that might be something where they might consider additional support and communicating that to their line manager or HR representative, yeah, human resources. So that is something to consider as well. Acquired neurodiversity, that is chronic, and not transient can be a result of a neurological illness or a brain injury. So head traumas, things like strokes, dementia, etc., can also lead to unacquired neurodiversity. Thank you for a question. If the person does not stay still when they're reading or writing, but they sit still when they are watching something, does that mean they have ADHD or dyslexia? I can't tell you for sure, but it might be, because when they're really engaged in something, they might be a bit less restless and a bit more focused, and that can be a sign of either neurodiverse condition, really. So yeah, completely possible. But we wouldn't in assessments, we would always take history to see, you know, what impact is that having on an individual. When I go into kind of the legalities of it, you will see why that matters. Okay, so another thing of note is that the representation with neurodiverse conditions is actually really, really high, or probably higher than you would imagine. It is between 15 and 20%. So depending on the sources that you're reading, or maybe specific industries that you look at, it is every 1 in 5 or every 1 in 7 individuals who is likely to have either of the neurodiverse conditions or multiple conditions. As I've said, yeah, this is also not uncommon. And what it means is this shows the positives of the evolutionary differences, as opposed to, you know, 15 to 20% of individuals have something wrong with them. And how to go about this? Well, really what we encourage employers to do is treat everyone as an individual and ask them, how can they support this individual to be working or learning at their best, and address their needs. Yeah. And you can also see that because it's such a high proportion of the population, there is quite a lot of considerations that we also give in assessments and in workplaces to strength and things that those individuals are able to do really, really well. So you can see that with dyspraxia, for instance, in things like empathy or intuition or verbal skills. With things like dyslexia, it's creativity and that visual or 3D mechanical thinking. With ADHD, is that hyper focus, so they wouldn't be distracted if they find something that really engages their interest and is something that is really, really motivating. Chances is they will work on this in their hyper focus to the exclusion of absolutely everything else. And it is really, really positive for their productivity, but they need to consider their well-being, yeah, to make sure that they sleep, eat, and address their needs as they go, even if, you know, something they're really, really passionate about something in particular. And I think the other bit that I want to quickly address, and you probably noticed the topic of the slide that says neurominorities, is the language around neurodiversity. If you haven't heard the term before, you may find it quite confusing that there's actually quite a lot of terminology around it. So we have neurodiversity or neurodiverse or neurodivergent. We got neurominorities or neurodivergence. You can always hear a term SPLD, which stands for specific learning difficulty or hidden disabilities or neurodevelopmental disorders. There's a lot there. And I guess the question I get asked a lot is which one's the correct one? And in truth be told, they're all correct. Yeah. And it's more the case of what is the language that summarizes your experience or experience of someone that you know, and just asking them, what do you prefer? What should I say, or what should I name the condition? They will tell you. Same applies to, for example, autism, because some people with autistic spectrum disorder, which is what it's known kind of formally, will say that they have autism. Some people will say that if they've had previously been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, they will just refer to it as Asperger's syndrome, and that is absolutely fine because it describes their experience, which is really, really specific. So that is absolutely fine there. So that is that. And I've mentioned that neurodiversity represents that kind of variety in human thinking across the whole population, across the whole globe. But when it comes to a specific individual and their abilities, what we see in the assessments is a variation, not globally, but within an individual's own abilities and skills. So what we would see is a spiky profile that you see on the screen in front of you. In fact, you probably noticed two lines there. The blue one represents a neurotypical profile of individuals that are unlikely to have a neurodiverse condition. And the purple line, which is a lot more spiky, is the ability kind of variation or distribution that we would see when someone might have dyslexia or ADHD or dyscalculia, etc. And so really to explain this, I think with neurotypical profiles, a good way of sort of summarizing them, I use an example of school curriculums, because that kind of generalist thinking is what you need to pass potentially school education. Yeah, you need to be reasonably good in reading, writing, maths, sciences, potentially IT, for example, or drama or physical education. Yeah, so there's quite a lot of different skill sets that are assigned to generalist thinking. What happens with neurodiverse profiles is a lot more specialist. So there will be areas where there are troughs and difficulties, and I will talk about those in just a few moments. But it's really important to understand that it's with neurodiversity is not the case of it being a room where all lights are dark, metaphorically speaking. It's a case of it being a room where some lights are shining actually really, really bright, and there are real talents and potential associated with neurodiversity. But it is more the case of maybe that person has been in an environment or a job which plays to their difficulties. And the question for us professionals who are supporting them is, how do we change that? How do we enable them to work and learn at their best? That is our focus. A little bit about specific areas where individuals may both exceed, but also where they may struggle. So something that is called perceptual reasoning, which is essentially visual thinking, but it's not just kind of art and creativity, it's also things like media communications, for instance, or business development, yeah, or that kind of entrepreneurship and being able to come up with new creative projects, and you know, really see the bigger picture, spot patterns in someone's behavior or in how something works or how something is being done, and learn through that kind of observation or noticing things. The other area where neurodiverse individuals typically excel is their verbal reasoning. It is their ability to ask the right questions, to communicate information and to summarize it in words and kind of understand the world through language, kind of parking the reading component of it, just being able to gauge with what is said in either a meeting or a lecture or a webinar, yeah, something like that. Articulating a point, yeah, and describing and explaining information. So this is slightly separate to good presentation skills, yeah. So some presentation skills is something that you develop, but that kind of confidence in, you know, communicating and maybe learning at your best when you've been able to discuss something with someone, as opposed to reading a book, for instance. Yeah, so that is your verbal reasoning. Processing speed can be a strength, can also be a challenge. Focusing attention when it's a strength, you would see someone kind of scanning visual information really quickly and, you know, really noticing different aspects of things and what can be changed for something to work better, for example. Yeah, so things like that. Making quick decisions on detailed information when someone's in the moment, that can also be a talent with neurodiversity. When processing speed is a difficulty, we would of course see kind of issues with reading speed, writing speed, yeah, just maybe being slower with new tasks, which is maybe particularly important if someone's starting a new job or a new role. You know, what support is there to support them in, you know, building up that skill set in that new environment, and have their success criterias, or, you know, bits that they need to do to make sure that they're performing and succeeding in the role. Has that been made clear for them? Yeah, and have they been supported with that? And the last bit that we look at is working memory. So think of it as, I'm sure you probably have heard at some point about short-term and long-term memory. So short-term memory is what I'm telling you today. It's like a little box, and with short-term memory box, yeah, the information I'm telling you today will stay there for a little bit. If it makes sense, if you've learned something really valuable today, or if you have revisited the presentation, either view the recording, or if you're going through the slides again, by the way, the slides will be shared. I apologize, I forgot to mention. Yeah, then, you know, if you found something meaningful, or you revisited the information again, it will go into your long-term memory, and you'd be able to retrieve that information whenever you need. But with working memory, it might be helpful to think of it as a sort of filter on top of your short-term memory. And you may find that you don't remember things like names very well, or phone numbers or messages are more difficult to just retain, and they just disappear as soon as you've heard them. But then in the same sort of breath, you may find that remembering faces is something that you recall easily, and maybe you've met someone years ago and you see their face and you still remember, you know, who that person is, and but you maybe can't remember their name at all. I know I am like that. So that is working memory. Messages, instructions, those can all be affected. And I suppose really when it gets to the fact that neurodiversities overlap, but also when it gets to an employment, regardless of a label, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, these are the sort of challenges that we see pretty much all the time. Yeah, I'll start with memory and concentration. I've mentioned, you know, challenges with focusing if you're in a busy environment, if you're in an open plan, or if there's a lot going on around you and you need to really attend to a task that's quite detailed, or you're writing maybe a report of some sort, or, you know, maybe more longer email, or you're doing some form of reading of any information, then being in that busy environment, both audially with noises, but also visually. Some people find that if it's too busy visually, then they get quite distracted and they easily lose sort of track of thought. But then also temperatures is something that we consider when we look at workspaces, be it at home or be it in the office. Temperatures, smells, sounds, and visual. And of course, we'd consider where people are seated, how often are they allowed to maybe work from home. Prior to the pandemic, this has been something that we were looking at quite frequently. Maybe using noise cancelling headphones, that is something we'd consider as well. And of course, kind of memory information. Yeah, how are they with remembering any actions that they've been given, maybe in meetings or by their line manager, for example. Yeah, have they been given things to do and have they written it down? Has it been followed up? maybe in an email or something like that, yeah? Or how do they record that information to address any memory difficulties? The second bit that we see affected with neurodiversity in employment is organization, and that will include planning and prioritizing. So juggling a number of tasks, maybe doing the tasks that are easiest early on and maybe pushing the more difficult tasks sort of further down the line and procrastinating on them a little bit. That happens, and putting those tasks off. Things like time management and taking longer to do the tasks, not quite knowing how long tasks take, or finding that you are taking longer with completing a specific task, if it's a report maybe, or a long email, or you need to write up a summary of some sort or a proposal. So that can be a bit more of an issue. I've had a really fabulous client a while back. This is and what happens with them. Thank you. Yeah, so what happened with that client, this is, as I said, is pre-pandemic sort of story. He would turn up to the office at 7 p.m. in the morning. The reason he was doing that is because he's given me two reasons why he was doing that. Because he was working in a quieter space and he could focus nicely. And also he would allow himself a bit more time to get things done, yeah, to get things completed. Whether that is a healthy approach, that's a separate question. You know, it may not be. There might be better things that we can put in place to support him in that situation. But when we initially meet a lot of the employees, they do share the experience of, okay, I do feel like I need to be putting extra time into my work, and there are other means of potentially addressing that. So I'll be talking about that in a moment. So yeah, that is what we see. In terms of the communication, I did say that individuals with neurodiversity tend to have good sort of verbal reasoning and communication abilities. But when we look at communication being a challenge in a workplace with neurodiversity, it's around kind of morale and motivation, and communicating that they need help, you know, or someone is struggling with maybe their workload, or maybe their understanding or their memory. Yeah, so it's those kind of things, anxiety, maybe being overreactionary to you know, feedback or comments, yeah, just not responding and not engaging really well in that communication, maybe also due to the lack of understanding what support might be actually available for the existing difficulties. You can find this awareness campaign that Genius Within has done online following these hashtags, and feel free to follow us on social media platforms. I'll put those up towards the end, but in that campaign we kind of reflected on the differences and the fact that, for example, yeah, dyspraxia is as common as 2% as red hair, so kind of 2%, and we're looking at physical traits, but then in terms of learning differently and thinking differently, isn't that just something that is quite similar? And moving into this kind of second part of our presentation, these are the times when a lot of first disability rights legislations have been introduced across the globe. So that is something of note. In the UK, we look at the Equality Act 2010, and this again addresses the notion of the overlap between neurodiverse conditions, I'll actually save you time reading the Equality Act, because it doesn't list any of the conditions that I talked about today, which you may find quite counterintuitive. I believe it has 8 conditions mentioned there, which include cancer and HIV and multiple sclerosis. But things like dyslexia or ADHD, they're not mentioned in the Equality Act, and the definition on the right-hand side of the screen is why that is the case. So a person has a disability if she or he has a physical or mental impairment that has substantial and long-term impact, 12-month plus, and that impact is adverse on his or her ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And as a result of that, we absolutely fully expect the employers to be providing and making reasonable adjustments to enable the employees to work at their best and meet their potential. I want to emphasize, someone's drawing on the presentation, never had that happen, I want to emphasize that there's no need for a kind of formal diagnosis to that extent. It's the effect and not the cause of the impairment that matters. And so we do use that in order to make sure that we secure support for individuals. Any questions so far? I've just noticed that there's been a question on the chat. Also, as I've mentioned, just to reiterate, I will be available in the speed mentoring after this. I know it's quite a short session. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask me independently, then by all means, I'll be there for this time, and you will be able to come up to me and have a chat. I'd really welcome your queries, your thoughts on the topic. George said, so if you're applying for a job and the employer says that they are an inclusive company, is it good to mention that you have a learning disability, as I believe there's a lot of stigmatization around things like ADHD and other neurodiverse conditions? That's all right, Adeola, that's fine, no worries, it's just quite interesting. George, thank you, that is a brilliant question. And disclosure is an interesting aspect. I think we can definitely have a chat, if you want, in the speed mentoring session about it. But as you can see from the legal definitions, it is employers' responsibility to be providing the support, but there's always questions around how you communicated and when you communicate that to mitigate any stigma or anything at all. In my experience, I've had clients that have gone through recruitments and disclosed their disability and have been successful in securing the job and have been provided with adjustments throughout the recruitment process. But equally, a lot of my clients are people that I meet once they're already in the role, and they may have been in the role for either a number of months or maybe a year or two, or they may have been in a role for a few decades sometimes, yes, quite a long time or a number of years, but there's been maybe some changes to, they've had new systems introduced or new ways of working, and all of a sudden they're finding that, you know, the strategies that they've used before aren't working as well, or maybe like a really simple situation. I've had someone who was in a technical role, and their systems where they record information has been changed, and the training that they have received was quite sort of untailored to things like dyslexia, or because what they've been given is a manual. Yeah, they haven't actually had proper training sessions. They've been given a manual to go through with maybe this new systems that has been introduced. His reasonable adjustment was simply to have a face-to-face training with a provider, with someone who knows the system really, really well, and have that training recorded as a video so they can always revisit it when they need it, and that solved any performance concerns that were there. So yeah. Something that, again, with the employers is quite important is the fact that we have various levels of inclusion, and there is still evidence that exclusion is still quite present. what we notice is that the disability employment gap, since the legislation has been introduced 10 years ago now, that employment gap remained the same. So what I mean by that is around 82% of individuals that are currently in a form of employment or work are abled, and around 52% of individuals have a disability. So that 30% gap remained the same. And of course, we still see exclusion numbers, so increased numbers of disability or neurodiversity in social minorities, in criminal justice settings, or long-term unemployment. So unfortunately, exclusion as a trend is still present, but it's not all doom and gloom at the moment. Sorry, I've sort of hopped ahead a little bit, but we'll look at compliance level of inclusion. When we do look at that level, what it means is this is an inclusion for an individual. So this is where a lot of our services are focused at the moment. And I must say, we've got quite good at compliance level and compliance support, kind of that individual support in a workplace. So if someone is struggling with their performance or as a result of a neurodiverse condition, we would consider maybe doing a cognitive assessment or a diagnostic assessment if they haven't had one before, potentially. Also, bearing in mind that legal definition, even if they haven't had a previous diagnosis, but they are displaying, challenges that I thought, okay, communication, time management, memory, organization, they might have a workplace needs assessment instead. In a workplace needs, we won't do any tests with them that we do in the diagnostic, but we would have a look at their role and what does that involve. So is it a lot of reading? Is it a lot of writing, a lot of communication? Is there a lot of processes that they need to, bear in mind and work with? And in a workplace needs assessment, I would have a good think with them what adjustments would benefit them and what would be helpful. I'll give you some examples slightly later on, but that is the workplace needs assessment for you. Also, things like individual coaching is something that we would look at. Deliberate inclusion is different because in deliberate inclusion, it's an emerging trend at the moment. A lot of companies in IT, you can look up SAP, for example, they are recruiting for neurodiverse talent specifically. So there's a lot of recruiting of autistic talent, for example, because their strength allow them to look at systems and see what we can be doing differently, or they have really potentially increased attention to detail, and employers do find it really valuable to utilize that talent, and hence we are seeing quite a number of neurodiversity inclusion employment programs popping up, which is really positive. The argument is that when we look at deliberate inclusion, there are limitations, like for example with the autism recruitment. Are they recruiting for dyslexia and dyspraxia and ADHD, or is it just autism? So that might be othering and not considering kind of the full neurodiverse spectrum as much. So what we really want to be doing is moving into, or what we really want the employers to be doing is moving into what we call systemic inclusion. Remember I said that the representation of neurodiversity is every 1 in 5 or every 1 in 7. And so with systemic inclusion, we want the employers to go, look, we are going to have individuals with neurodiversity one way or the other. We might as well enable routes of disclosing, neurodiverse conditions or health needs, and consider the work processes, for example, performance reviews, for instance, or how we manage someone's performance. What are the essential tasks for their role, and what changes we can make to those processes. What are the things, like for instance, eye contact in a role for someone who is a data analyst? How essential is that, or is it just socially constructed? Chances is it's not essential for that specific role. So, has the employer made reasonable changes to their process? But at the moment, we are all in that compliance, mostly in the compliance level, where it is individual inclusion and individual support. So this is emerging. And as I mentioned, a few trends on the exclusion. Yes, so there are quite high rates of unemployment with autism and dyslexia. And also we see kind of the criminal justice, the settings having quite high rates of ADHD, as opposed to maybe 3 to 5% of a general population. Of course, when we talk about stigma, we always mention direct discrimination. So things like making assumptions about someone's capability. What it means is thinking that someone, for instance, someone with dyslexia can't write a report. That is not the case. They can have an assistive software. They might need some strategies to plan what they're doing. But really, it's an assumption that they can or can't do. That is wrong. Failure to make reasonable adjustments and support an individual, and then victimization and harassment and making negative comments about neurodiversity or disability is completely unacceptable and is against the law. So the employers need to be aware of that. And of course, in terms of indirect discrimination, this is again very much what I was talking about in that systemic inclusion, where by default we assume everyone is equal, and what we know from neurodiversity, by the definition, everyone isn't equal. And so we need to encourage employers to make those equitable changes, and making sure that the work processes are tailored to individual needs, and ideally really preempt any firefighting there, and enable disclosure and enable conversations around neurodiversity and employment. So that is really, really important. And I suppose kind of to further on that, why make everyone go through the same system if they're good at different things? Adapting processes and allowing individual strength, and thinking about the end result in a role, or even if you're in studies, thinking about that end result of a project, and not only focusing on what the process for that might be, maybe changing the process slightly. And of course, you probably are interested in the adjustments that are available in a work setting. I'm mindful of time, so if you want to talk about this a little bit more, please come and find me in the speed mentoring session. But the question I ask here quite commonly is, what do people think is the kind of one of the most, or kind of the three most useful or efficient adjustments? What's happened is Dr. Nancy Doyle, who is also a CEO of Genius Within, she has done a research with 500 participants who have recorded the adjustment that worked really well for them. The adjustment number one was executive functions coaching, or one-to-one neurodiversity coaching. And I will tell you why that was the case. So we work with adults in employment, and they come into our services with experience of education, with experience of school studies. Maybe they've had some form of employment in between. And they found ways to cope. They did employ strategies, maybe they've had previous support, and so they will know the sort of things that enable them to work or learn at their best. And what executive functions coaching does is it essentially harnesses that and builds up or tailors those strategies to a specific work setting or a specific job or a set of specific tasks to really enable the individual to thrive and work to their own potential. So that is what we would focus on. That being said, we moved away from literacy coaching a little bit because the assistive technology has really become that substitute. Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if you know, perfect spelling will become something like an obsolete skill in 20 years because we just have such good technology to support us. But with assistive tech, some of the most popular stuff is things like speech to text or text to speech softwares where you talk at a laptop and it will write for you. Or if you have an electronic reader, you can just select information and it will be reading the information. Amy, thank you. I see your question. With disclosure, it's quite an interesting topic. I'm just mindful of time, but do find me in the speed networking after this, and we will have a good chat about disclosing neurodiversity or requesting support or adjustments. It's better to have it on individual basis as opposed to kind of a generic discussion, if that's okay. But it is a really, really essential question, and I'm glad it is coming up. So thank you, Claire. There is a link and a password for GatherTown, so do join in. I'm actually going to copy that myself. So yeah, executive functions coaching is that. And with assistive technology, there's a lot more assistive tech available these days, like pens that would read for you, or mind mapping softwares that look like really cool and professional project management tools. Yeah, so those are all available. And actually, really, if you think of it, a touch screen some 20, 30 odd years ago has been an assistive technology, and now it's gone completely mainstream. So you do have on smartphones, on laptops, if you're interested in researching it, you can always just Google neurodiversity in Microsoft, and you should have the whole suite come up if you're using Microsoft. Macs, I know that Apple has the inbuilt accessibility features as well. So whatever online system you're using, I would give you a bit of a task, a bit of a homework to really have a bit of a research if you can access those already, and have a play around with them, see what it does. I'm sure everyone has tried voice messaging or pressed that little microphone on Messenger to dictate a message to a friend or a parent or someone, a partner. So yeah, those are definitely out there. I've talked about environmental flexibility, yeah, some scheduled flexibility as well. Supervisors input, and we do quite a bit of line manager training or awareness training for teams to facilitate that. So those are just some of the ideas. And also some of the more specific strategies, yeah, so taking regular breaks or using visual reminders. Post-it notes, anyone? Index cards, colourful papers to record information, yeah, colourful diaries or highlighters. Those are well loved in neurodiversity. The idea with strategies is that they're meant to be simple, because chances is people are going to use them most if they are stressed or if they're feeling under pressure, if they're for an increased workload that they need to plan and prioritize. Yeah, those then will be the easy strategies that they can use. Online calendars, color coding, time blocking, things like that. And you can consider those strategies yourself already. So that would be quite important. And of course, I'm telling you about all these wonderful adjustments that are being made, but do they actually work? And the good news is they do. We have been collating this information for around 10 years. which is how old Genius Within is, a bit of a young teenager. And we are noticing quite significant success rates. So we have 95% job retention after receiving coaching and after implementing the reasonable adjustments I've mentioned. We have improvement in performance, both reported by the employees themselves and also by the managers. So that is really, really positive. And we also have sort of around 25% of our clients that we work with being promoted within a years of receiving coaching. So we are very, very proud of that statistic. Yes, the slides, I will be sharing those after, and they will, I will also share some resources. You can look out for our online blog that Genius Within has. We have a Forbes blog run by Dr. Nancy Doyle, where you can find a lot of information actually around disclosure, but also around recruitment for neurodiverse talent. So yeah, if you want to just go on Forbes website and type in Dr. Nancy Doyle and just go through the archive, the information will come up, and they're bite-sized pieces. Yeah, they're not extensive complex reading pieces. So I would highly recommend to have a look at that information. But also do, as I said, yeah, do follow us on our social media platforms if you wish. These are just some of the services that we provide in Genius Within, but of course all of this information is available on our website as well. And to finish up, I just want to leave you with this parting thought. The inclusion is a moral, social, and it really is an economic imperative as well. Really, when we are squandering individuals' potential, we're all missing out really substantially. So what are the means of us not doing that? And that is all. Our social media is basically Genius Within CIC on all of the platforms. So have a Google and feel free to follow us there. And that is all for the presentation. I am really hopeful that this has been helpful. Thumbs up if you enjoyed it.